We are thrilled to welcome Dan Zak tonight. His website will tell you that he is an adjunct professor of nothing and a winner of no awards. However, he is a staff writer of over a decade at the Washington Post. He's written countless excellent profiles, columns, and features. He's written about places from the Marshall Islands to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where this book takes place. In 2012, 3 anti-nuclear activists broke into the Y-12 National Security Complex in Oak Ridge, otherwise known as the Fort Knox of Uranium, which is terrifying. Almighty, which is Zak's first book, is about those activists and about the history of the American nuclear project. Kirkus called it a scrupulously reported, gracefully told, and exquisitely paced debut, and we could not agree more. Now, Dan is in conversation tonight with Kelsey Davenport, who's the Director for Non-Proliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association. And she's the expert, so I'm handing the evening over to her. So everyone, please join me to welcome Kelsey and Dan to Politics.
Hi, everyone. Hi, is this on? Good. Thank you very much for coming. I guess I thought we would start with me talking about how I became interested in this topic and how this story came to me. First, let me say I'm pleased that Kelsey is here to talk with me, because I consider myself very much a curious and mostly uninformed citizen who became very interested in this topic and did his best to try and understand it. And Kelsey is the expert. So I think between us, we'll be able to answer both dumb questions and very specific expert questions as well. So I was born in September of 1983, and 2 weeks after I was born, a Soviet colonel just outside of Moscow, in a bunker that was arranged to detect incoming missiles, got an alert that there were American nuclear missiles headed toward Russia, and that it was his decision to kick the notice up the ladder so that the Soviet Union could retaliate. And it was his decision alone. And he had this proof on the radar that these missiles were coming. And he thought about it and thought, this can't be right, even though the machinery designed to alert the Soviets said things are on their way. And if he had said, okay, we'll kick this up to the Kremlin, the Soviets would have launched a retaliatory attack. He alone decided, we're not going to do this. It's got to be a false alarm. And it was. Soviet satellites had picked up the sunlight off clouds and had interpreted it as missiles. So that is the global climate I was born into. But I feel like I grew up in a very different place. I came of age after the Cold War. Nuclear weapons really had no salience in my life. We were no longer eye to eye with Moscow in that sense. My first kind of introduction to weapons of mass destruction was the Iraq War, and of course they did not exist. And so it's something I never gave much thought to until 2008, when I took some time off from work and did a semester at Sea Like program that was sponsored by the Japanese government. And it was basically a cultural exchange thing for 6 or 7 weeks, sailing to different places, going out to Tokyo. And it was very interesting, cross-cultural communication and fun. But on the very last day, as we were saying goodbye, and it was a group of Americans saying goodbye to a group of Japanese young people, a Japanese friend that I'd made during this time came up to me as if she had been wanting to talk about this the entire 6 weeks, and she said, "Hiroshima." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, how can we make sure that never happens again? And I was like, I don't know. And it came out of nowhere. And it really gave me pause, because I think my experience as growing up an American is far different in terms of relation to nuclear weapons than a Japanese person. So that really stuck in my mind. And then fast forward to 2012, I'm a general assignment reporter at the Post. I write about you name it. I don't focus on any particular topic. I'm not a beat reporter. I don't focus on national security. But a story made its way to my desk about this break-in at this nuclear weapons facility in East Tennessee. And the news item said 3 anti-nuclear activists had intruded onto this weapons site where we store the enriched uranium that is not currently in a warhead somewhere. And it was 2 men and 1 82-year-old Catholic sister. And I kind of sat up because that sounds preposterous. And I thought, well, I'll just write a short, fun story about this goofy thing. And of course, to do that responsibly, I had to kind of understand, what is this site that they broke into, and who are these people, and why did they do it? And as I started to do that kind of remedial self-education, I realized that there was a lot more to talk about. And there was a lot that I didn't know. And so I became fascinated partly by this topic because of what I didn't know. And I felt like, as someone who viewed himself as a concerned citizen of the world who likes to keep up with the news, the fact that I didn't know that this site existed, the fact that I didn't know that we had thousands of nuclear weapons that were still deployed in the ground, in the upper plains, in submarines, in the Atlantic and the Pacific, currently, right now, ready to go in case nuclear war needs to be waged, and that we spend so much money to maintain and secure them, and we weren't really getting our money's worth because 3 peace activists had broken into this site. And so I was kind of hooked from there. And so my kind of engagement with this topic was very, it was kind of random, I think. But I was hooked, and it kind of developed into this book project. Now, I wasn't going to read anything, but then I talked to some friends beforehand. They said, well, you got to read something. We came for a reading. So I'm going to read 2 paragraphs, and then we can start talking. These 2 paragraphs come near the end of the first chapter of the book. And the book is deliberately, almost ludicrously expansive. It ranges from 1927 to 2015, and it takes place in Washington and Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where the site is, to the Marshall Islands in the Pacific, to Vienna, to the United Nations, to the Nevada desert. And I thought I couldn't think of another way to tell this story than to tell it as wholly and as comprehensively as possible. And so these 2 paragraphs it'll give you a sense of what the book is about and where it goes. So if you'll indulge me. By the new millennium, the United States would spend $10 trillion on nuclear weapons programs, more than any other government expense except Social Security and non-nuclear defense, and begin spending $1 trillion more on modernizing the arsenal for the 21st century. Nukes, in other words, would be America's 3rd highest national priority ever. Along the way, the weapons would evolve from a strategy into a policy into a faith. They would hasten doomsday and also be credited for delaying it. They would be detonated in experiments all around the planet, in desolate expanses out west and on remote islands in the Pacific. They would be attached to missiles on high alert that were buried in the ground or loaded into submarines that roam the oceans. They would create economies, inspire movements, and destroy lives. They would survive accidents and budget cuts and outlast presidents and wars. They would number in the tens of thousands, spread to other countries, and then recede from view. But they would remain the pinnacle of human ingenuity and insecurity, a force that binds American power and threatens to blow it apart, a paradox to be pondered and maybe one day resolved. All the while, a counterforce pushed back. Men and women of science and of faith believed that humanity was too frail to tangle with the Almighty. The mere possession of nuclear weapons to them was a wish for death. Before a nuclear weapon was even detonated, movements to abolish them were underway. The anti-nuclear campaign would draw energy from every corner of the earth, and it would grow and shrink, triumph at times and fail at others. It would propel people into noble lunacy, to lay down in front of trains and trucks, to scale fences and climb onto submarines, to march in the streets and through the desert, to plunge into the technicalities of warhead design and congressional budgeting, to spend years in court and prison with no hint of reward or promise of victory. They would seek nothing less than the transformation of the American identity. It would seem impossible, but every now and then the impossible would occur. So that sets up kind of the rest of the book. And of course, what I mean by the impossible is this event at this nuclear facility in East Tennessee that these 3 peace activists were able to break into in a most unlikely fashion. So that's kind of the broad overview of things. So now we can chat.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for coming tonight, and thank you, Dan, for having me and for giving me the opportunity to read the book before it came out. It's absolutely wonderful, and I caution you against going home to start it now because you may not put it down, and for those of you who have to go to work tomorrow, that could be a bit difficult. But one of the things that really struck me, and growing up in the same generation as yourself, where nuclear weapons are largely an abstraction that don't have that same sort of psychological impact and pull as our parents' generation who lived through the Cold War, or our grandparents' generation who fought in World War II, is that you put a face on the abstraction, and you demonstrated the different sort of psychological impacts that these weapons have had on people, how that motivated them to act. But you also told it side by side with the story of the development of the policy, why Y-12 was built, what happened there, what the people who lived there thought. And so I'd be interested to hear from you, what motivated you to tell these stories side by side, and why did you think it was important to bring in that more sort of science and policy-based aspect of the discussion so deeply into your book?
I think part of that is just because I've lived in Washington for 15 years, and I am endlessly fascinated with how Washington functions and malfunctions in regard to everything, and especially now in regard to what is essentially the ultimate power. This is nuclear weapons are mankind's most destructive creation, and yet we have they're babysat by bureaucracy essentially, because that's what Washington is very good at creating, to manage most anything. And so I was kind of tantalized by the cosmic power of these weapons and the banal, complicated bureaucracy that maintains them and that secures them. And so if I was living somewhere else, maybe I wouldn't have focused so much on Washington. But when it comes down to it, Washington is the entity that funds the maintenance and the modernization of these weapons, the deployment of these weapons, decides on policy, what to do with them. The president is the person. It's the president's arsenal. So the brain and the nervous system of the nuclear weapons enterprise is in Washington. But you're right. I as I started to report on this topic, I found it like trying to report in a foreign language. It's such a techno-strategic, jargonistic thing to research and talk about, and you have to kind of know the vocabulary in order to ask the right questions. I mean, if you're talking to nuclear experts in Washington, a lot of the time it's about treaties, it's about delivery systems and warhead names. It's about the W-80 and the B-61, and if you start talking in this jargon, you kind of get away from what they're intended to do, and they're intended to kill a lot of people. And so I think Washington has developed this vocabulary that takes out the human aspect of it, and so I wanted to bring the human aspect back into that, and the 3 activists, Michael, Sister Megan, and Greg, were the perfect kind of human faces, because they broke into this site to try and remind people that this thing called the Y-12 National Security Complex is actually a place that maintains and works with an arsenal that they find to be immoral and illegal, because of what it does to human beings. And so I saw an opportunity to kind of talk about both. And I also didn't want to short shrift the people in Washington who do the hard work of trying to keep things safe and trying to work inside the system, and who are working in this bureaucratic structure with great concern and nobility. And I think to not acknowledge them as part of this would make the story incomplete, I guess.
it's interesting that you ended with kind of that discussion of Washington and some of the tensions within Washington and thinking of what to do next, because you leave us at the end of the book with kind of a very interesting tension. And I think it actually relates back to the story you told about your encounter with this Japanese citizen, and kind of that question of how do we ensure that this doesn't happen again, versus this sort of very bureaucratic, we need to move to disarm in a step-by-step fashion. We need to make sure there's reciprocity. And at the end of the book, we see that tension between this group of countries that is trying to sort of reclaim the narrative to move towards banning nuclear weapons, and that pushback from the states that possess nuclear weapons wanting to continue in this slow kind of step-by-step fashion. So you leave us with this tension, and I'd be interested to hear sort of your opinions on how do you see this playing out?
Yeah, I have no idea. The tension is kind of goes right to the top, because every president since we developed the bomb has spoken out publicly about how they're the worst things in the world and we shouldn't have them, but then they make decisions to maintain them or improve them, to grow them in number in some cases, and more recently to reduce them, but nevertheless kind of recommit to them in some way. You have JFK talking about the sword of Damocles hanging over your head, but approving a warfighting plan that would essentially be a massive attack on the Soviet Union and China and kill 600 million people. He signed off on that. You have Reagan saying a nuclear war, should not be fought and can never be won. And of course, he deploys Pershing II missiles to Europe to check the Soviets. You have President Obama, who there's a chapter in the book that focuses on President Obama because he's someone who's actually had nuclear weapons on the brain since college. He wrote his senior thesis about non-proliferation, about the Soviet Union. And of course, his first speech abroad after becoming president was the Prague speech, which was about seeking the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. They gave him the Nobel Peace Prize for it. And then within a year or two, he essentially endorses what's going to amount to a $1 trillion modernization of these weapons that will keep them operational until the 2080s. And so kind of the tension starts at the top. You have rhetoric that is aspirational and that is acknowledging the horror of these weapons, and you have executive action and congressional action that kind of maintains them, I guess. And you mentioned this humanitarian movement, and I'm not sure, if anyone is familiar with that. There's a movement that's very energetic abroad, especially in Europe, to get a group of nations together and hold a convention to ban nuclear weapons, to make them illegal under international law, with or without the participation of the U.S. and Russia and the U.K. and France. They did it in Ottawa with other kinds of weapons in 1996, and they hope to do again with this, to establish a norm, to say, we don't care about the foot dragging of the U.S. and everything. We're going to go ahead and get together, and we don't like these weapons, and they're illegal, and they should be banned. Because they're sick of countries like the U.S. saying that no one else should have them because they're so terrible, but we need them for our security. I mean, that's just, I think there are people in Washington who have convinced themselves that that is completely logical, but a lot of the rest of the world doesn't see that. And in order to make some inroads there, they've focused on the humanitarian effects of nuclear weapons use. And so they're trying to kind of bring the argument out of techno-strategy and out of kind of wonkiness and say, these weapons just kill a lot of people. They're bad for the environment. Even a limited exchange between India and Pakistan, 100 nuclear weapons, could cause climatological effects that kill 2 billion people. I mean, this is kind of the argument they're making. And of course, countries like the US says, we are not ready to, we believe that's the wrong thing to do, and we believe the solution to this is a step-by-step gradual reduction in concert with Russia over who knows how much longer. And I think in that you have the tension that exists between activists on any issue and policymakers. Activists always want things to happen faster than policymakers, and it doesn't matter the issue you're talking about. Of course, this issue, it kind of involves the fate of the Earth, so it's a little more interesting to me.
or a little more scary, depending on
that's true.
which way you look at that. You talked about activists, though, and one of the things that resonates for me in the book is the strength of conviction for these activists, and many of them found that through the church and the Catholic Church. But it's also very seated in their own experiences, whether, for the Catholic nun, having grown up, in the same building as someone who worked in the Manhattan Project, for the veteran, his own experience sort of within sort of the military complex. How do you think, and based on your interviews with them and your experiences with these activists, how can we talk about nuclear weapons? How can we drive home the importance of this issue, the need for greater urgency when we talk about nonproliferation and disarmament for a younger generation that hasn't lived through these same sort of psychological and very sort of powerful commemorative historical moments that really shape thinking on nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer to that. I think part of it is to move it out of the techno strategy and the jargon, and talk about it in human terms. One of the non-scientific conclusions that I came to while working on this book is that I feel like every generation has enough brain space to grapple with one existential crisis at a time. And I feel like our generation and maybe younger generations and maybe a little older, it's environmental, it's climate change, it's the sense that we are moving inexorably to something that cannot be corrected, and it's going to be devastating worldwide. And I don't know how anyone else feels, but that's enough to think about. And we can also see easily evidence of that happening. You could go online and watch a Manhattan-sized chunk of ice collapse, from a glacier, and you can see evidence of this. Nuclear weapons, you can't really see it. There's certain parts of the world you can go to, and there's definite evidence of the effects of testing and all of that. But it's not like there's explosions, every day around here, and it's like, oh, this sounds terrible. Look what it does. So, I think there's a need to make it real in the absence of kind of very specific evidence of its destruction, and I'm not quite sure how to do that. I think talking about the humanitarian aspect of nuclear weapons use is one way, because there are plenty of people still alive who have been affected in some way, and not just Japanese people. Downwinders in St. George, Utah. A lot of what they call atomic veterans, American citizens who have worked in labs and plants for decades, have had health effects in dealing with manufacturing nuclear weapons. So I think there's a way to bring it home by using kind of these witnesses to what can happen even before you detonate one. They're dangerous. I think that's one way to do it. But I think the other way is to kind of pair the existential crises together, because as I mentioned, you have a regional nuclear war, you're going to have an effect on the climate because of everything that's kicked up into the air and everything. So I think there's maybe a way to talk about them in the same breadth, I think.
Well, as somebody who speaks the language of nukes, and I'm sure has dropped my fair share of acronyms and very technical terms when talking to people, I will try and take that under consideration. What do you think? What do you want people to experience when they come away from this book? I mean, what do you want them to take away and take with them and continue to think about after they've reached the last page? For me, it was just, I kind of wrote the book with the reader in mind, being myself 4 years ago. What would have helped me understand this as completely as possible, both what's happening now and historically what has happened that informs it. And so I would just say, and I definitely kind of wrote it for people who came of age after the Cold War. And so I would just hope that people come away with it for an awareness, a general awareness, I think. Nothing more specific than that, because it is so easy to ignore the fact that not only these weapons still exist in large numbers, some 15,000 still on the planet, but that we are preparing to spend that much more money on them, and
that will happen unless people say, well, maybe it shouldn't, or maybe it should happen slightly differently. And there's a character in the first chapter of the book who was a biophysicist at Columbia University during the Manhattan Project. It was someone that Sister Megan, one of the activists that are the subjects of the book, grew up across the hall from this biophysicist, and she remembers hearing about the secret work of the atom happening in New York at the time. And this biophysicist wrote plenty of public essays about science and morality. And after the bombs were dropped in Japan, he wrote a book called Explaining the Atom, because he thought that the public needs to know the science behind these weapons. And in the preface to the book, he said he wrote it because he hoped that the book made intelligent voters. And I don't want to seem that's what I'm trying to do, I guess. Is I hope that, for young people anyway, this kind of helps to inform them and kind of make intelligent voters, I guess. I guess that's my one hope for it.
Well, as someone who entered this field by sort of a similar gateway, taking a course with somebody who was very involved in organizing the million-person march on Central Park against nuclear weapons, and then having the opportunity to intern with Senator Richard Lugar, who was very involved in going into the Soviet Union and securing nuclear materials, it is incredible what that little bit of knowledge and that little bit of an awakening can lead to. And for me, it's kept me into this field and has taught me the language.
We came into this kind of similar, but I think we were both raised Catholic too, and so there was something interesting for me, not really having heard much about the Catholic worker movement despite going to 12 years of Catholic school, not hearing much about Dorothy Day, and they're a major part of this book, kind of the Catholic element of it. I was used to, grade school and the nuns being rule makers, and so that is a nun who is a rule breaker, like Sister Megan, is I think what initially really grabbed me and made me read about this. We're happy to take questions now, and especially if you have questions for Kelsey too, if you have questions about the Iran deal. The first anniversary is today of the Iran deal. She can answer any kind of question about the Iran deal. And tomorrow actually is the 71st anniversary of the first ever nuclear test in New Mexico. So we're kind of in the season of anniversaries, and then of course Hiroshima and Nagasaki next month. So we can keep blabbing if no one's got questions, but I would love to kind of engage with people in the audience, and also hear from people who might be veterans of the anti-nuclear movement, who have much more life experience on this topic than either of us have.
Thanks a lot, Dan, for writing this book. I know all three of these marvelous activists. I hope this isn't true, but I haven't read the book yet, I'll be buying one tonight, but I think you may have called them criminals in the book, and I think that's an inaccurate description of what they did. The real criminals are people that are contemplating using nuclear weapons, et cetera, et cetera. The second point is, I heard you on National Public Radio, and again, I hope I'm wrong on this, but at the end of the interview that I heard, you said that Obama had to spend the $1 trillion to refurbish these weapons. And I think you really know, now that you've met the Catholic worker movement, that that's a theft from the poor. So any comments on those two questions?
I have comments, yes. I honestly can't recall where in the book I might have called them criminals. Mm-hmm. I can assume that what I was trying to do with this book is to look at this story from multiple sides. And what I've learned, having spent time with a range of activists, is that my desire and appetite for nuance and from considering a bunch of different sides, even when there appears to be a right and a wrong, is somewhat anathema and rubs people the wrong way. You'll probably read this book, and at times I'm writing from inside the brain of Washington officials who are trying to rationalize things. and I can foresee you maybe thinking that's objectionable. I know of no other way to write a story than to try and understand the brain and the heart of everyone who's involved. In terms of President Obama having to spend another $1 trillion on these weapons, I think what I said was the awful quandary of, if we're deciding as a country to maintain an arsenal, isn't it reasonable to talk about, well, if we're going to have them no matter what, they better not explode on their own, they better not harm people. And I think that is the awful predicament that President Obama is in. I tried for a year to get an interview with him because I was interested in his trajectory from a peace-minded college student at Columbia University who was very concerned about the Reagan arms buildup, to 25 years later being the guy with the codes to launch these weapons. And I can only imagine that there is a tremendous conflict in his brain and his heart that I would love to have asked him about. But I can't purport to stand up and shake my finger at him and say, how dare you, when I can't imagine that position, I guess. If that sounds like equivocation, I don't know what to say. I would have loved to have asked him about that frustration that is in his heart and his soul. But then I try and imagine, what if I'm president and I am, and I can't see a way to get rid of these weapons, because if I try and say we're getting rid of them, Congress won't give the money to get rid of them responsibly. That's the problem. He can't just say we're getting rid of these, because Congress will fight him tooth and nail. And so if you're going to find yourself with these weapons and they're aging and they're falling apart and they're becoming dangerous, I can understand someone who says, well, we need to spend a little money to refurbish them. I can understand that. I'm not saying I advocate that, but I can't pretend not to try and understand someone in that predicament. That's probably not satisfying, but that's kind of how I thought about the book and wrote the book, is trying to understand the humans in each part of this story, what motivates them and what ties their hands in some cases. So.
Thank you, and I hope you continue to explore the subject.
Sure. Thank you for your question.
You're welcome.
As a follow-up on that, and I'm not an expert, but my recollection is that in order to get the New START confirmed by the Senate, the Republicans insisted that the president promise to devote, I don't know how many billions of dollars.
$88 billion.
And, this is a tough decision for the president. New START resulted in a reduction in nuclear weapons by both the Russians and by us. And I think you expressed this in your previous answer, but these are difficult problems, different issues. And just ask one more question to show where I come from. Hiroshima and Nagasaki will shortly be 71 years ago. And I'm asking you, both of you, this question, and I've answered it for myself. How likely is it that we are going to go another 71 years without a nuclear device being exploded in an urban area?
I'll take the first question first. And you're right. It is the New START deal with Russia, which happened in 2010, was a perfect example of how what a compromise governing is. The U.S. wanted a follow-on treaty with Russia, and Congress would not ratify it unless the president promised a reinvestment in the stockpile. And maybe, Kelsey, you can, if you have thoughts on that deal, you know more about that than I do. I don't know. What do you think the takeaway is from? And also, I should say, and maybe you can back me up on this, the reductions in New START in terms of the number of warheads were very, very modest. That treaty was essentially to extend, I think, a verification regime that allows us and Russia to watch each other's nukes. That was really, I think, the core of it, because I think the treaty itself knocks, it's very small, the reduction. So it was less a reductions treaty than it was, we're going to continue to poke, to peek in on each other's sites and warheads. Do you have thoughts about the New START treaty and the deal there. And
Well, I think Dan, your point sort of speaks very well. Is as long as we have these weapons, we should ensure that they are safe, because there are certainly a number of stories we can tell about sort of near misses, near accidental detonations, near thefts, not only in the United States but in a number of other countries. But spending money to keep warheads safe versus spending money to reinvest in all of the legs of our triad at a level that will keep the numbers we have today at a similar level 40 years from now, I think is not a commitment to disarmament and is not a commitment to the United States following through on what it's obligated to do under the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. So I think that getting New START was good because it does give us that verification with the Russians that I think is very important. But I think that we need to now push against those assumptions of how we refurbish and extend the lifetime of our own arsenal, with a more optimistic view that we can continue to make cuts, and that we can sort of fulfill what Obama has said and move towards a world without nuclear weapons.
yeah, and I will say, here's an example. The president, and with the backing of the Pentagon, has said we can reduce our number of deployed warheads by 1/3 and still meet our military objectives. But we're not going to do it unless Russia does it.
I think that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
I mean, if the U.S. government, backed by the military, can say that we can meet our strategic objectives with this force, that we still think we can deter Russia, then why can't the U.S. take that step? And there are some who go even further. Former General Cartwright, he says we could go down to 300. So I think that taking that thinking into consideration when we consider sort of planning for the future could be important.
And I think the last part of your question was the likelihood of seeing some kind of a detonation in the next 71 years. I mean, I don't know. All I know is that, nuclear experts I talk to think it's a possibility. But you probably know more than I do.
And I think there are unfortunately some steps that are coming that are making it more and more likely. We have Pakistan, who has developed low-yield tactical nuclear weapons on very short-range missiles. If they transfer command and control authority to commanders in the field in the event of an escalation, would the fog of war result in a commander making a decision to launch a first strike against an incoming Indian invasion? India is looking at putting nuclear warheads on submarines at sea. Does it actually have the command and control to ensure that there wouldn't be some sort of accidental or intentional launch if communication lines were breached? So there are a lot of these concerns that I think are emerging because we have perpetuated this paradox that these destructive weapons ensure peace. And we continue to escalate that to keep peace.
Who wants to go get a drink? Yes, ma'am.
Excuse me, thank you. Thank you for bringing this topic back. I was wondering if, if you, instead of talking just about the president and the bureaucracy, if you speak about the power of the military-industrial complex from way back, and in this case the nuclear energy industry, which if it had been phased out, would eliminate the excuse for proliferation.
So I made a point.
And one other question, have you spoken in your book about the Quakers who have been active? The Quakers who have been active in this campaign for decades.
Okay. I'll answer the last question first. The focus of this book is very much on the Catholic worker movement and on anti-nuclear activists. I will say that one of my very trusted sources in helping me educate myself about this is the Friends Committee on National Legislation, who are a great force for good in Washington. They do a lot of lobbying on the Hill, anti-nuclear lobbying. Oh gosh, what are the other questions you asked? The military-industrial complex. Yes, and starting from the get-go, because the deployment and the dropping of the bombs on Japan were, in a sense, happened for multiple reasons, but it was also partly because we had spent so much money that the project had developed a momentum of its own. And there's actually a quote in the book from a U.S. official saying that now that these bombs have worked and we've spent $2 billion on this project, Congress is not going to throw me into jail. It was essentially like, he could not have overseen this project without some kind of result in it, I guess. And I do talk about in East Tennessee and Oak Ridge and in Rocky Flats in Colorado, where we had a nuclear weapons plant, that we create economies all around the country, whether it's a lab or a plant or a base, and unfortunately, once you create an economy and you create a job base, it is hard to dismantle that, particularly when you have congressmen who are interested in winning re-election and are interested in more short-term goals, such as re-election, instead of thinking, do we really need this particular plant or this particular base or this particular lab? So that is a secondary theme throughout the book. And I feel like there was a third question. Oh, yes, nuclear energy. I made a point to stay away from nuclear energy because I thought that the book would be 1,500 pages then. And also, it seemed to be too daunting for me because I recognize the danger of the atom, of nuclear energy. I recognize that it is capable of great harm and destruction. I wanted to focus on devices, but at the same time, nuclear energy is supposed to do good, right? It's intended to do good. Whether or not it does, that's up for debate, I think. A nuclear weapon is designed to kill large amounts of people, and I thought I would just focus on that. That was my choice in order to keep the book under 400 pages. Do you have any thoughts about any of that?
The only one thing I would say in your question about the military-industrial complex, I think at times one of the difficulties in challenging them is that they even managed to shroud some of their plans for reconstituting some of these systems, under the guise of not releasing information and secrecy, and I think that just perpetuates the problem further.
I just noticed there's a line over here too. So.
Well, I'll take a segue on that. That is the problem. It's the secrecy. The secrecy enables the people in power to say, oh, yeah, we need this money to make these weapons safer. I don't know how you make a nuclear weapon safe at all, but the first thing you want to do to get to the young people, dispel the myth that the bombs won a war. They didn't win a war. Anybody who reads books, Decision to Use the Atomic Bomb is one. It was the Soviet invasion that compelled the Japanese to surrender. Everyone knows this. The top military brass at the time knew this. Our intelligence knew this. Yet even the president will not tell the American people the truth that that's not won the war. I know why, because it's politically unpopular. But that's what keeps politicians being able to say, oh yeah, nuclear weapons are needed because we have a historical lesson that it's a complete lie. It's a complete fabrication. And if you really want to get young people interested, I used to work at the National Archives, plenty of pictures of what actually happens when a bomb is dropped on people. Now, and then you just tell them magnify that by 100,000 times or whatever, the arithmetic is. Because what do we say to people? The Holocaust, never again, never again. And how do we do? We show them the pictures. We tell the stories. I think it's very easy, but I definitely compliment you on choosing to write a book about this most critical of topics.
Thank you for all those thoughts. And you're absolutely right about secrecy. I mean, the modern classification system was born of the Manhattan Project. We had to find a way to make sure that this technology was not accessible to the public or to other countries. And it's still a very secrefied, very secretive, highly classified, rarefied realm. I still have freedom of information requests that are out there for a book that's already done. I'm saying they're 2 and 3 years old. I waited for one freedom of information request for 18 months. And I got back a 100-page report. And I was like, yeah, okay, great. And every single page was redacted. 18 months to make sure that they were giving me nothing. So that continues. And of course, there are plenty of people in official Washington who say, well, it needs to be secretive. But I go back to that thought of the biophysicist in the first chapter saying, the public needs to understand so they can vote intelligently. And I don't think that is necessarily available today. I don't know if you have thoughts on working in a very classified realm, the seeking of information when they won't give it to you.
No, it certainly is frustrating, but I think one of the great strengths of open source information now is that there are other outlets where we can understand how centrifuges work, where we can get a better idea of how thermonuclear weapons work, of some of the elements that are actually going into to thinking and decision-making about the arsenal. The one thing I would respond to, though, in your question about how do we sort of combat the myth that that these weapons sort of won a war, is that for some of us growing up, and I speak from my own personal experience here, from a grandfather who believed very deeply that the use of these weapons saved his life. But when you grow up with that is a very difficult myth to overcome, and it's a very difficult belief to challenge. So how we choose to engage with those perceptions and those histories, I think we do need to take on that argument, but we need to do it carefully, and by building up education, then we can move to greater sort of public awareness involvement.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for writing this book. Congratulations. It's quite an achievement. So I know you went to the Marshall Islands for part of your reporting on this. And the thing that has interested me about that is that, and it sort of speaks to what this gentleman was saying, is that if something isn't right in front of us, we don't pay attention to it, especially now. And the Marshallese are so hidden, and their plight is so far removed. And it seems, I don't have another word for it, but it's super gross, that everything is done so far from public view. And I wonder, I know there have been some murmurings and developments in the Marshall Islands. Maybe you could talk a little bit about your trip there and just sort of what is happening with those people currently.
Yeah, I went to the Marshall Islands because they sued the U.S. Just 2 years ago for breaching the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And I'm sure many of you know, but I didn't, and that kind of feeds into the shame and the guilt that has fueled the writing of this book. I had no idea that for a period of 12 years, from the 40s to the 50s, we tested our nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands. They're a group of coral atolls between Japan, Hawaii, and Australia. And the testing that we did there, if you parcel out the explosive power of the testing we did for 12 years, it was equivalent to setting off 1.6 Hiroshima bombs every day for 12 years. And I just cannot believe that is not in an American history book. Maybe it is. I don't recall learning about that as a history student, civic student anywhere in school. That seems like a very profound chapter of the Cold War that I don't think is taught very often. And so I wanted to go because I felt like that part of the story was I wanted to tell it in a book that I wanted to put it back in the narrative somehow. But I also went because they were essentially doing what Sister Megan, Michael, and Greg, the three activists who are the main subjects of the book, were doing, which is that they are saying the U.S. is non-compliant with international law by even possessing these weapons, that the U.S. is not exhibiting good faith in reducing the number of them fast enough. And so whereas Sister Megan, Michael, and Greg committed an act of intrepid civil resistance, the Marshall Islands decided, well, we're going to sue in international court and in San Francisco court, and say the U.S. is non-compliant with the with the premier nuclear weapons arms control treaty. And so, I went to the Marshall Islands last year for just for 9 or 10 days, and I was going to say it's hard to put into words, but I wrote a story about it for the Washington Post. So I did it. I did at some point put it into words, but I've never seen such a stark representation of really important decisions made years ago that have resulted in continued suffering now. That is just completely off the American radar screen. We essentially, because of this testing, unmade and remade an entire people who've lived on these islands for thousands of years, and not only did we move them around and expose them to terrible fallout and pay them off, but we maintain an army garrison there still, and we use them as the bullseye for unarmed tests of intercontinental ballistic missiles still. A couple times a year we will fire a missile from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, unarmed of course, and it will land in the Marshall Islands. So even though our explosive testing ended there decades ago, they're still part of our security apparatus. And so it was just, you used the word gross. Yeah, it was, as an American, it was a terrible feeling to go there and feel like, even though I was not alive when decisions were made to do this, to be so ignorant of the continued suffering of people there. And so that's why they're about a half a chapter of the book. It takes place in the Marshall Islands, and what's going on there today, and this lawsuit that they had going. So, yeah, it's just very sad.
And one of the things that I think Dan captured very well is that, for me as someone who works on these issues, I was of course aware of the testing and of the effects from the testing itself. But he also captured the great cultural and economic toll that was levied on these people by the mere presence of the U.S., by the disruption of life, that was powerful for me in a whole new way. So
yeah, and actually that goes back to kind of the military-industrial complex. We introduced a Western economy to this island nation, and we put a military base there, and we pay the highest wages in all the Marshall Islands, and so everyone moves to this tiny little island, and it's one of the most crowded places on Earth. And they've all moved to this tiny island so that they can take a ferry over to work and flip burgers on the American military base, and then which is kind of Club Med-ish. It's not I think a high priority post for people, contractors or people in the military, but it's nice. And then at the end of the day, they take the ferry back to a place where there's raw sewage in the streets, overrun with garbage, and they're all crammed in there because the military pays $12 an hour. So it was very gross to go there in 2015 and be like, God, the testing might have ended in I think in 1957 or 8. But the effects it's still right in front of you. It's just you have to kind of fly thousands of miles to go see it. Yes, sir.
You didn't mention at any point the issue of taking weapons off firearm. They're on a what do they call it? Alert trigger. Yes. I think that as a first step and a vital step, because that is one of the greatest dangers. Obviously, the complexity of negotiating in step with Russia is that for Russia, nuclear weapons are their only claim. Their military is very weak, but their nuclear weapons, and they're now talking about improving their weaponry. And so we have to face in our negotiations that maybe you have someone you're dealing with who isn't prepared to really talk about nuclear weapons and in the way that we want to, but we have to maybe test it, and maybe test it by little steps and see if that leads anywhere. Now, obviously, that doesn't lead you anywhere with North Korea. There, it's any president has to. But in that case, we don't need nuclear weapons to destroy North Korea. So, I think that the comment about the end of World War II, I thought was very simplistic. And anybody who was out there knew at the time, was in Okinawa, or knew we couldn't be sure how the Japanese would respond to an attack. And we overestimated it. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of rumors. There were reports coming through of peace overtures to the Russians from the Japanese, but that doesn't, faced with the problem of losing perhaps 1 million American lives, I think it was an understandable but horrible decision.
Yeah, I think these two opinions are emblematic of this ongoing inability to kind of fully reconcile with a decision that happened so many decades ago. And there's a chapter of the book that deals with the trial of these activists. And even during this trial in 2013, what came into the trial was essentially a relitigation of that decision. You know, this case had nothing to do with Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but still the U.S. prosecution brought up the fact that said, they brought up with witnesses, they said, what ended World War II? And I couldn't believe it. In a courtroom in Knoxville in 2013, this decision was part of an open court inquiry. And I thought that was fascinating and quite telling too. Yeah, I'm glad you brought up hair trigger or high alert or prompt launch, as it's I think called. We do maintain a significant number of nuclear weapons that are ready to go as we speak and can be launched within minutes of the president's order. And there are plenty of people who say that is a vestige of the Cold War. One small step we can take is to de-alert them. And I think maybe you know more about this than I do, but maybe not. I don't know. But that is very much, and actually there are rumors that that President Obama in his final months is going to make a series of decisions, one of which would be to do that. It's the rumors now, I don't know. But I think on his plate there are some unresolved issues, and I think that might be one of them that he tries to resolve.
Well, I think that there are rumors that that's on the table, as well as the U.S. moving to a no first use policy, which I think would be a very potent political symbolic action for the president to take. A number of countries, including China, have already declared no first use. And I think that increasing the amount of time it would take to fire a nuclear warhead would also be an important step. The French and the British, for instance, have more time built into their launch sequences. The Chinese store their warheads separately from the delivery systems, again ensuring sort of more time so there isn't that prompt launch. And so I think that the U.S., particularly given the strength of our conventional weaponry, can and should take that step regardless of Russia, because I see, as you say, sometimes we need to look for areas where we can sort of test that relationship and look for options to move forward. But there are also times when we can lead, and I think that this is an area where we could do so.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Great. Congratulations on publication. I think we're in a campaign cycle that will likely be remembered as redefining political rhetoric in many ways. In looking back through the history of this issue, have you seen moments that would either give voters clues to look for messages from candidates or a way to navigate this issue? It may not even come up to much of a degree in this cycle, which is perhaps telling in another way, but what's your rubric or litmus test for candidates now?
I mean, I looked at the presidential debates in the last couple of presidential elections, and nuclear weapons come up in those televised debates, but they came up in the context of Iran, talking about a weapon that does not exist yet, rather than the ones that we have, which I think is interesting. In this campaign cycle, I think more than usual, we've heard nuclear weapons. Donald Trump, it will come as no surprise to all of you, has been somewhat contradictory in his remarks about nuclear weapons. He's said that they're horrible, and he would be the last to use them. And then he says, well, maybe Japan and South Korea should get them, which is kind of a crazy thought. That is proliferation. Hillary Clinton has made it. Has talked about nuclear weapons in the context of temperament, that we cannot allow Donald Trump to be the person who has only minutes to decide what the right thing is to do with the fate of entire swaths of the earth at stake. So whether or not that will translate to useful, specific, constructive questions in a debate, I don't know. But I think it's telling that we're at the time of this cycle where we do revert as a country to the elemental power that we invest in these people we elect as president. When it comes down to it, the president makes a bunch of decisions, but the most serious is that, I think, is in a situation, do they exercise really the sole authority to launch a nuclear strike? So I don't know. I know that Hillary Clinton, in the last time she ran for president, would not rule out use of nuclear weapons use against terrorists, was very much saying that they are part of our security. Although she was caught on a rope line, asked about this modernization plan. We're going to spend $1 trillion to modernize the arsenal. And she kind of gave this off-the-cuff answer, being like, "Yeah, that doesn't sound right to me. I'm going to look into that." So I think you could see that and be hopeful, maybe or she might not have even heard the question and was just responding with some very anodyne answer. Any thoughts?
Well, I will be hopeful, because I think some of the people who surround Clinton when it comes to foreign policy and defense issues have expressed concerns about the money that we will spend on the arsenal going forward to modernize all three legs of the triad. Have said that not only is it unaffordable, but in some cases some of these elements are unnecessary. So whether or not she is thinking that, or just I'm encouraged by the fact that she's surrounded by people that think that. But getting back to sort of your comments on Trump, and I think it also comes back to your comments, sir, about sort of hair trigger alert. And I've seen some interesting polling that for a certain population of swing voters who are unsure about Trump, it is this question of him having control over the nuclear arsenal that makes them doubt whether or not he could be a good leader and whether or not he should be president. It's not his offensive comments about women. It's not comments about race issues. It's not comments about building a wall against Mexico. It's this question of whether or not we can trust Trump with making a quick decision about the use of nuclear weapons. And I think that the fact that this man has made it so far towards the presidency and we have doubts should bring into question, what can we do about alert status? And should anybody have the power to move that quickly with such a devastating weapon?
Yeah, and it's a reminder that this is a decision that Congress cannot check. The Supreme Court does not weigh in. It is the decision of one person. And I was thinking yesterday, I was like, all these people who are concerned about executive power and the power of the federal government, I feel like this should be part of the conversation. It's there's a term that's out there in a book that's called thermonuclear monarchy. This world-ending arsenal is the control of one person, and so I feel like that's something we should be talking about more. I think we only have time for one more question. I could go all night, but you're it.
Great. So this is more of a process question for you, I guess. In the course of writing this book, whose stories did you find were the most difficult or the most challenging to really, nail down or put into words, kind of the most difficult to flesh out, and how did you overcome that?
One particular challenge was, when Sister Megan, Michael, and Greg, got into this site, the guard who was the first to arrive on the scene is a character in the book, because he'd worked in nuclear security for 30 years. He'd worked for contractors for the U.S. government, for the Department of Energy. So he had since he was a young man, had devoted his life first at Rocky Flats, and then at Y-12 in East Tennessee to working, to guarding nuclear material. And he did so after his brother died, after his father died young, after his uncle died young. They all worked at this site in Colorado. And he was a tough nut to crack, because he not only was he was a taciturn guy. He wasn't given to a lot of self-analysis, and it was hard to get him to reflect about his life, about his work, and that was challenging. And so I had to come in other ways. I had to talk to his sister. I had to talk to members of his family who could talk about. I had to talk to the widow of his brother, who for years had to deal with a husband who was 40-some years old and exhibiting signs of advanced Alzheimer's and then unable to dress himself because the chemicals that he had worked around, the plutonium that he'd worked around, had shrunk his brain. And so I kind of had to come around to that, and so that was challenging. The three activists, Sister Megan, Michael, and Greg, are so articulate and eloquent about what they do and why they do it, and this guy was not. And so I found that a tough nut to crack. But he was integral to the story because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm interested in the brain and the heart and the spirit of everyone in this enterprise, this nuclear weapons complex, and he for me represented the patriotic American who believed that the work he was doing was keeping America safe, and he really believed that and believes it still, even though he no longer works there because he was fired. So that I think was the greatest challenge, was telling his story and having to do it using going through family and talking about very, very difficult issues and asking questions like, was it worth it? Is it worth it? And, how could you keep doing this job when you watch your family members who are also doing the job getting sick and dying? And so those are tough conversations to have. But, I got there and I hand it to him for being open enough about it to allow me to do it. And so he's a significant part of Chapter 5.
And I think his story, too, should remind all of us that we don't need to go to the Marshall Islands or to Hiroshima and Nagasaki to see the continued impact of the nuclear complex on our country. There are people in our backyards who are still suffering from this.
Before we say goodbye, I want to thank Kelsey for being here. And for the work she does in Washington, the being knowledgeable about this, so we don't have to be necessarily, or as much. For those of you who didn't ask questions, I'm happy to talk to you afterward. I'm very interested in this subject. Thank you to Politics and Prose for having us here. And I want to. They might not want me to do this, but I have to. If you see on the back, here are the three activists on the back, and it's Michael Wally, Sister Megan Rice, and Greg Borgi-Obed. I have to point them out because two of them are here. Sister Megan is right here in the second row. And I don't know where Michael Wally is, but he's wearing a tricorn hat. So it was because of them and their example that all of us are here talking about this issue. So thank you to them, and thank you to everyone for coming.